Greetings, story lovers. Pull up a chair and open your ears, for I have a tale or two just waiting to unfold. The deadliest sniper in history never once looked through a scope. He never craved glory, and when the war was over, he just went back to his farm like nothing ever happened. Simo Häyhä wasn't born to be a legend. He was born to tend fields, hunt game, and live a quiet life in the forests of rural Finland. Standing barely 5 feet tall, his hands knew the weight of a plow far better than a rifle. When his neighbors spoke of him, they'd maybe mention his steady aim during hunting season, but nothing more. Then winter came in 1939, and with it, an army. The Soviet Union, one of the world's most powerful military forces, invaded Finland with nearly 1 million soldiers. They expected a quick, easy victory against a tiny nation of farmers and loggers. What they got instead was bitter cold, deep snow, and something they couldn't explain. Men vanishing without a sound, one after another, in forests that seemed to have come alive with death. One of those unseen killers was the quiet farmer, Simo Häyhä. Dressed entirely in white, he crawled through massive snowdrifts in temperatures that could freeze flesh solid. He would pack snow beneath his rifle to stop the muzzle blast from revealing his position. He even chewed on snow to keep his breath from forming clouds in the Arctic air. And he waited, sometimes for hours, with the patience of a hunter who'd spent his whole life reading the silent language of the woods. But here's what made him truly terrifying. He refused to use a telescopic sight. While other snipers relied on scopes, Häyhä used only iron sights, the simplest, most basic aiming method. Why? Because a scope's glint in the sun could give away his position. Because it forced him to raise his head higher, creating a bigger target. And because in that brutal cold, scopes would fog up and freeze over. Häyhä trusted only his eyes and the rifle he'd carried since he was a boy. In less than 100 days of combat, he killed over 500 Soviet soldiers. In just 3 months, in the freezing darkness, often from distances exceeding 400 meters, with nothing but iron sights. The Soviets had a name for him, Belaya Smrt, the White Death. They sent entire counter-sniper units just to hunt him down. They carpet-bombed forests where they suspected he might be hiding. They offered bounties. They lived in constant terror of a 5-foot-tall farmer they couldn't see, couldn't catch, and couldn't stop. To them, he wasn't human anymore. He was winter itself, judging them for trespassing into a land that didn't want them there. On March 6, 1940, an explosive bullet finally found him. It struck his jaw, completely obliterating the left side of his face and sending bone fragments through his skull. The soldiers who carried him from the battlefield were convinced he was dead. When he finally regained consciousness, 11 days later, the war had ended. Finland had held its ground. Against impossible odds, against a superpower, against the largest invasion they'd ever faced, Finland survived. And Simo Häyhä, disfigured but alive, had become the ghost story that Soviet soldiers would whisper about for generations to come. But this is where his legend becomes something deeper. Häyhä didn't want parades. He didn't write memoirs. He didn't go on tour giving speeches. He just went home, back to his farm in Rautjärvi, back to his dog Killa, back to hunting moose instead of men. He lived a simple, quiet life until he passed away in 2002 at the age of 96, having survived 62 years beyond the war that made him a myth. When journalists later asked him how he felt about killing hundreds of human beings, he said only this: "I did what I was told to do as well as I could. No bragging, no guilt, no attempt to justify or glorify what he'd done. Just a farmer who defended his home when his home needed defending, then put down the rifle and picked his life back up right where he'd left it." There's something incredibly profound in that. In a world obsessed with fame and legacy, here was a man who could have lived forever in the spotlight of his own legend. Instead, he chose the snow, the silence, and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. The deadliest sniper in history was a 5-foot farmer who became a ghost when his country needed him, and then simply became human again when it didn't. But Simo Häyhä's whispers through the snow carried on the very breath he learned to hide, reminding us that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones you see coming. Have you ever heard a story so wild it sounds like it's straight out of a Hollywood movie? Well, buckle up, because this one is absolutely true, and it involves undercover agents, shady dealings, and a man in a gorilla suit. Our story begins in 1993. Officials from a zoo in Toluca, Mexico had a big problem. They wanted a gorilla, a magnificent silverback, to be the star attraction. The thing is, getting a gorilla isn't like buying a goldfish. There are international laws, CITES conventions, all designed to protect these endangered animals from illegal trafficking. But these zoo officials, they decided to take a shortcut. They reached out to a primate dealer in Miami, Florida, thinking they could just buy a gorilla on the black market. Bad move. This dealer, thankfully, was on the right side of the law and immediately tipped off the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And this is where things get interesting. The agents didn't just dismiss it, they saw a golden opportunity to catch these traffickers red-handed. They decided to go undercover. So they created a whole persona for themselves. Shady, experienced animal smugglers. They contacted the Mexican buyers and said, "You want a gorilla? We can get you a gorilla." To make their cover convincing, they needed to show the buyer some real apes. They arranged viewings at legitimate Florida zoos, pretending the gorillas on display were the ones for sale. They'd walk the buyers past the enclosure and say, "See that big fella over there? That's him, prime specimen." The buyers, completely fooled, were thrilled. They were ready to make a deal. The agents set the price at $92,500. A hefty sum, but the buyers agreed. They arranged the final handover. The location? A private hangar at Opa-locka Airport just outside of Miami. This was the perfect spot for a clandestine exchange, away from prying eyes. The plan was simple. The buyers would arrive with the cash, inspect the gorilla one last time, and then the animal would be loaded onto their plane bound for Mexico. Now here comes the million-dollar question for the agents. How do you deliver a gorilla that you do not actually have? They couldn't just borrow one from a zoo for a sting operation. That would be incredibly dangerous for the animal and everyone involved. The solution they came up with was pure, unadulterated genius. It was so audacious, so theatrical, that it was perfect. They decided to use a guy in a gorilla suit. Yes, you heard that right. An undercover agent was tasked with playing the part of the magnificent silverback. They got a Hollywood-grade gorilla costume, incredibly realistic, and a sturdy transport cage. The agent inside had to practice. He studied gorilla movements, their grunts, their posture. He learned how to shake the bars of the cage convincingly, how to look menacing and powerful, all while being stuck inside a hot, furry suit. The success of the entire operation rested on his performance. The day of the sting arrived. The air at Opa-locka Airport was thick with tension. The undercover team was in place. The gorilla was in his cage, waiting in the dimly lit hangar. The buyer's plane landed, and they walked into the hangar, carrying a briefcase full of cash. They approached the cage, eager to see their prize. Inside the suit, the agent knew this was it, the moment of truth. He started his performance. He grunted. He banged against the metal bars of the cage, making it rock back and forth. He stared them down with what he hoped was primal intensity. The buyers peered into the cage. They saw a large, dark, hairy shape moving around, looking every bit like a powerful and slightly grumpy silverback gorilla. They were completely convinced. It worked. They handed over the briefcase with the $92,500, and as soon as the money changed hands, the trap was sprung. The hangar doors flew open and teams of federal agents swarmed in. "Freeze! Federal agents!" The buyers were stunned. Their jaws dropped, but the biggest shock was yet to come. Right in front of their eyes, the back of the gorilla unzipped, and out climbed a very sweaty, very triumphant US Fish and Wildlife agent. Can you just imagine the look on their faces? One moment they're illegally buying an endangered ape, and the next that ape is unzipping himself to reveal he's a federal officer. It's a scene you couldn't make up. The zoo officials were arrested on the spot, and the case, known as Operation Silverback, became legendary within law enforcement circles. It was a massive victory against wildlife trafficking, and it sent a clear message to smugglers everywhere. The US Fish and Wildlife Service will go to extraordinary lengths to protect endangered species. This story isn't just hilarious, it's a powerful reminder of the creativity and dedication of those who fight to protect our planet as wildlife. It shows that sometimes the most effective weapon against crime isn't just firepower, but a brilliant idea and a very convincing gorilla suit. The world of animal conservation is full of heroes. And on that day in 1993, one of those heroes happened to be a man pretending to be an ape. What do you think is the wildest part of this story? Let me know in the comments below. It's a testament to the fact that truth is often stranger and funnier than fiction. Imagine you're 30 years old, dying of tuberculosis, and coughing up blood. What do? Well, if you're Robert Louis Stevenson, you write a pirate story to entertain a bored 12-year-old, and in the process you accidentally invent everything we think we know about pirates. His name was Robert Louis Stevenson, and the book he wrote on rainy afternoons in Scotland changed adventure fiction forever. He was born sick. In Edinburgh, Scotland, in the 1850s, Robert Louis Stevenson came into the world with chronic respiratory problems. He had fevers that wouldn't break, lungs that hemorrhaged, and doctors who just shook their heads telling his parents he probably wouldn't even survive childhood. Most of his youth was spent in bed. He was too weak for sports, too frail for school. While other kids were outside playing, his playground was his imagination. He created elaborate fantasy worlds, staged epic battles with his toy soldiers, and told himself stories that transported him far beyond his bedroom walls. His father, Thomas Stevenson, was a respected lighthouse engineer, a serious, practical, successful man. He expected his son, Louis, to outgrow all this childish daydreaming and join the family business. And Louis tried, he really did. He studied engineering, then law. He even passed the bar just to please his father. But he never practiced a single day, because in his heart, he was a writer. He always had been, and he always would be. His father was baffled. His family was disappointed. And Louis, he was still sick, still broke, and still living off his father's money while he wrote essays and travel articles that barely paid the bills. Then, he fell in love. Her name was Fanny Osborne. She was an American woman, 10 years older than him, separated from her husband, and had 2 children. When she returned to California in 1879, Stevenson did something crazy. He followed her, against his parents' wishes, against all medical advice, against every bit of common sense. He crossed the Atlantic in steerage, the cheapest, most crowded part of the ship. He crossed America on immigrant trains. By the time he arrived in California, he was emaciated, desperately ill, and half dead from the journey. But he married Fanny in 1880, and she became his fierce protector, managing his career, rationing his failing energy, and literally keeping him alive when his lungs threatened to give out completely. Fast forward to the summer of 1881. They're in a cottage in Scotland. Stevenson is 30 years old. He's still unknown, still sick, and still financially dependent on his father. He'd published a few essays, some travel writing, but nothing that made him famous or financially stable. And Fanny's 12-year-old son, Lloyd Osborne, was bored. It was raining, as it often does in Scotland, and everyone was stuck indoors. To pass the time, Lloyd pulled out his watercolors and started painting a map of an imaginary island. Stevenson watched the boy paint. He asked to see the map, and he saw something Lloyd didn't: a complete story. He took the map, added details, and labeled it Treasure Island. He marked locations like Skeleton Island and Spyglass Hill, and then he put a big X to mark buried treasure, and he started writing. Every single day Stevenson wrote a new chapter, and every evening after dinner he would read it aloud to the whole household. Lloyd was completely enthralled. The adults, who were skeptical at first, soon found themselves just as caught up in the adventure. Even Stevenson's father, the serious lighthouse engineer, became one of the story's biggest fans, suggesting plot points and inventing details about Billy Bones's sea chest. For maybe the first time in his writing career, Stevenson was just having fun. His essays had been serious work, literary, respectable, but Treasure Island, this was pure play. And here's what's so extraordinary about what he created. Almost nothing in Treasure Island was based on historical pirates. He invented nearly all the pirate tropes we now consider authentic. Treasure maps with an X marks the spot. That was him. Pirates with peg legs and parrots on their shoulders? Stevenson. Singing sea shanties like 15 men on the dead man's chest? Him again. The whole romanticized image of swashbuckling adventure. All Stevenson. Real historical pirates were brutal criminals. They rarely buried treasure. They spent it as fast as they could. They didn't sing while they worked. And they definitely didn't have theatrical personalities like the pirates we see in movies. But Stevenson's pirates were so vivid, so memorable, that they became the template for every single pirate story that followed. And then there was Long John Silver. He wasn't just a one-dimensional bad guy. He was charismatic, intelligent, and even genuinely affectionate toward the young hero, Jim Hawkins. But he was also capable of ruthless, cold-blooded violence. He was one of the first truly morally complex villains in children's literature. He taught young readers that bad people could be likable, that evil isn't always obvious, and that the most dangerous people are often the most charming. Stevenson wrote the first draft of the book in about 15 days. An incredible burst of creativity, driven by his desire to entertain his stepson and his own excitement for the story. But getting it published was a struggle. It was too long for a children's book, too adventurous for serious literature, and too unconventional for Victorian tastes. Finally, a magazine called Young Folks agreed to serialize it. The response was mixed. Some readers loved it, others thought it was too violent for children. It didn't make him much money. But then, in 1883, it was published as a complete novel, and something incredible happened. It became a phenomenon. Adults loved it just as much as children. Critics praised its vivid characters and tight plotting. It sold steadily, then explosively. Suddenly, the chronically ill writer, who had been scraping by his whole life, was an international celebrity. Treasure Island gave Stevenson financial security for the very first time. But more importantly, it gave him confidence. He followed it up with more classics. Kidnapped, and the even more famous Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But his health was still failing. Doctors sent him to one supposedly healthy climate after another. Switzerland, France, the Adirondacks. Nothing worked. His lungs were giving out. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time. So in 1889, Stevenson and Fanny made a radical decision. They sailed to the South Pacific, hoping the tropical climate might finally help. They visited the Marquesas, Tahiti, and eventually settled in Samoa. And remarkably for a time, Stevenson's health actually improved. The warm climate and the outdoor lifestyle gave him a few more precious, productive years. He built a house called Vailima. The Samoans gave him a name, Tusitala, which means the teller of tales. They respected him, not as a sickly foreigner, but as a man who told powerful stories and treated them with dignity. On December 3rd, 1894, Stevenson was helping Fanny make mayonnaise for dinner when he suddenly collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage. He died that evening. He was only 44 years old. The Samoan people carried his body to the top of Mount Vaea, fulfilling his wish to be buried overlooking the sea. His tombstone bears his own poem, Requiem, which reads, "Under the wide and starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie. Glad did I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will." Robert Louis Stevenson lived a short, difficult life, much of it in pain, much of it believing he would die young. But in those 44 years, he created stories that have entertained millions for over a century. Every pirate movie you've ever seen owes a debt to the book he wrote just to entertain a bored kid. Pirates of the Caribbean. That's built on Stevenson's template. Peter Pan's Captain Hook. He's a descendant of Long John Silver. Every X marks the spot treasure map. Every one-legged pirate with a parrot. Every R matey. That's all the legacy of Robert Louis Stevenson. He wasn't supposed to survive childhood. He lived to 44. He spent most of it sick. But he left behind stories that will live forever. All because a dying man decided to entertain a bored 12-year-old on a rainy afternoon. Not bad for someone who wasn't supposed to make it past 30. Every story has its end, but another is waiting just up here. And if you seek more tales, be sure to subscribe below.